after major problems, after major projects, after big stuff happens or is completed by the federal government, they complete an assessment of what happened and what they did and what they can do better or different next time. And this assessment is called Lessons Learned. So that's what we're doing right now. Lessons Learned, 1929 to 1945. First, domestic affairs. This is an editorial cartoon. Manpower that could be winning the war. In fact, what the editorial cartoon is saying, of course, it's just too much bureaucracy, too much red tape. So many people could be fighting, but it's just taking too long to get them in the military or to get them in the civilian sector. Well, economics. The big lesson was that the federal government needed to and could regulate the economy. That an unregulated economy is a disaster for us nationally and individually. That we need a regulated economy. Businesses have proven themselves since the end of the Civil War to be acting in their own best interest, not in the interest of individual employees or us as a nation. This is very Hamiltonian. The idea that people are selfish, self-centered, egotistical, and left to their own devices, they will do what's best for themselves, and the hell with society. Well, that's what we finally figured out during the Depression. An unregulated economy is a bad economy, is a dangerous economy. And part of regulating the economy is creating a social safety net. People sometimes need a little help. Sometimes people need a lot of help, but people need help. And so one example of that is going to be Social Security. A little something that you get each month to make the difference between having your heat on and having it turned off. Remember, Social Security was not a retirement plan. It was not meant to pay your own bills. It was not meant for you to quit your job and have Uncle Sugar take care of you. It was a small stipend to help you not get kicked out of your house, to help you to be fed. That's it. Now, over time, Social Security becomes this idea of a retirement plan, which, as we'll find out, is an economically dangerous idea. Well, major projects that the federal government in part can help the regulation of the economy by launching massive major projects. This was not the case during the unregulated economy. Businesses were supposed to take the lead in things like building a railroad. And our taxes changed from yearly to monthly, because the reality is the federal government is doing a lot of stuff, and so it needs a lot of money on a regular basis. So we have regular monthly taxes. Oh, monsters. We've always had monsters. During times of war, national emergency, or even peacetime, we've had monsters. Monsters during the Revolution were the British. The monsters afterwards were Indians. And the monsters were slave owners, and the monsters were the Spanish, and the monsters were the Germans. Well, we also developed this idea of a monster living within or amongst us. We have to watch out for that fifth column. And during World War II, it was Japanese. We're going to have that development of an internal monster ever since. Sometimes it's going to be, quote, illegal aliens who are taking our jobs. Sometimes it's going to be suspected communists. Sometimes it's people who, have ruined this nation, who do not support, quote, making our nation great again. And this goes hand in hand with the creation of jobs. The federal government, during the time of an unregulated economy, did not create jobs. The idea was, we're going to give corporate welfare. We're going to give federal money to companies and they'll create jobs. Well, that did not work. In an unregulated economy, companies take money from the federal government and do not create jobs. They create more wealth for corporate owners. So, another lesson learned is that the federal government can and should be an employer. And of course, today in the United States, the federal government is the largest employer. Both civil servants and contractors. Urban migration. The reality is we finally leave the farm once and for all, and we become a country of people living in cities. And at first, as this editorial cartoon shows, that's going to be problematic. I mean, it's still problematic today. In the 21st century, we still segregate. We self-segregate. Not by law, not by perdition, but we choose to. We typically live amongst people who look like us because the people have the same color of skin. The belief that we have is that they think like us, they act like us, they work like us, they eat like us, they do push-ups like us, and we're comfortable being around people who we perceive to be like us. Ah, yes. Big thing. The federal government needs to regulate the economy. That the economy is not seasonal. The economy doesn't ebb and flow. The economy does not rise and fall like rivers. The economy should be regulated to keep the lows from being too low and the highs from being too high. The federal government found out that that universities are really good for research. One, universities are where you find the vast majority of your PhDs. Second, the universities is where you find the vast majority of people working on their PhDs who are really hungry. Hungry for both experience and hungry to eat. And so the federal government gives money to universities who then hires their PhDs to perform a task or to meet a goal. And then these PhDs, these professors, hire grad students to actually do the work. Grad students work cheap. The other reality is the consolidation of big business. More and more smaller companies are joining forces. They're becoming these huge corporations. Lockheed becomes Lockheed Martin. So many of these small contractors, these small aircraft industries are being gobbled up by people like Lockheed and Boeing and others. Women become a major part of the workforce. During every war, during every national emergency, going back to the Revolution, federal government has asked women to leave the house and participate equally in the war effort. And then after every war, the federal government escorted women back in the kitchen to make us chocolate chip cookies. Well, after World War II, that's going to change. There's actually going to be more women working in the civilian sector in 1947 than 1945. After World War II, American women will be asked to step aside to give those jobs to their returning husbands and fathers, and women say no. Another lesson learned was curtailing liberty, that there are some groups out there that if allowed to fully use their First Amendment, it could be detrimental to American society. This also goes hand in hand with internal monsters. There was a representative from Texas, north of Houston, East Texas. Boy, I can't remember the congressional district's name. Anyhow, his name was Martin Dies, and he was in charge of a group that will eventually be called the House Un-American Activities Committee. And during World War II, he will investigate the possibility of Americans who are working with Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan. As this editorial cartoon suggests, Dies missed the actual monsters. And that's his big prize. something that is relatively harmless. Second, we have foreign affairs. One of the first casualties of World War II is isolationism. The reality is we cannot draw up the bridge and create Fortress America. Although sometimes our activities abroad are not necessarily consistent. During World War II, we're going to war to, end the totalitarian regimes in China and Germany. Well, the reality is we supported a lot of totalitarian regimes, military dictatorships in our own backyard. In South America, in Central America, in the Caribbean. And President Roosevelt was asked about this. How can we possibly talk about the four freedoms going to war against the Nazis and against the Japanese when we have our own dictators in our own backyard, dictators that we support? And Roosevelt very famously said they, meaning our military dictators in Latin America, they may be sons of bitches, but they're our sons of bitches. And that's going to be a central part of the American philosophy ever since. They may be evil, brutal, nasty dictators who kill tens of thousands of their own people, who do not support equal rights, who do not support civil rights, but they're pro-American. So we're going to look the other way. This is actually a photograph of the dictator of Nicaragua with his two sons, who will play somewhat a role during the Cold War. Military alliances. George Washington, when he left office in his going away speech, he said, do not engage in foreign entanglements. If we join a military alliance, then we will be pulled into one war after another. Well, we were pulled into several wars, World War I and World War II, and we did not have alliances. So now the idea changes that maybe if we have an alliance, we can prevent major wars. And we have the Pentagon and other massive installations built specifically to lead efforts regarding warfare. Oh, by the way, we changed the name from the Department of War to the Department of Defense. It's much more friendly, right? War is aggressive. Ooh, we're going to get them. Defense is, hey, we're minding our own business, and they attacked us. Next, we move to wartime diplomacy. Wartime treaties. We're going to make treaties with foreign governments, some of which we will maintain throughout the Cold War, others we will not. Like here's a picture of President Roosevelt with the King of Saudi Arabia. And the King of Saudi Arabia was very concerned about the number of European Jews migrating to Arab Palestine. And so FDR promises the King of Saudi Arabia that the United States will never recognize a Jewish state in the Middle East unless the King of Saudi Arabia approves of such a thing. That turns out to be a false promise. Fear of revolution. We've always had this fear of revolution. There were three major revolutions in in the late 1700s. The American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and the French Revolution. And although they all succeeded in getting rid of their masters and forming their own governments, Americans viewed the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution as a failure because of how bloody they were. And so ever since the American Revolution, Americans and the federal government has been fearful of revolutions. We may not like that evil, brutal, nasty dictator, but it could get worse. So we're going to support really nasty, evil, brutal dictators out of the fear that it could get worse. A good example is Libya. Libya will be run, or was run for decades by, an evil, brutal dictator. A guy named Gaddafi comes to power in the 1960s. Well, he's very aggressive, both in terms of his policy with neighboring states, supports terrorism, and is very vehemently anti-U.S. But we don't do anything to get rid of him because the fear is if we get rid of him, things get worse. And by the way, it did get worse when he was finally removed from power. Same thing in Iraq. We'll talk about that in detail later on. Aiding the world. We have to be that arsenal of democracy. We cannot allow the world to be their own individual islands. We must aid the world. Militarily, economically, materially, whatever it is, we have to aid the world. So here are the big themes. One is the expansion of the federal government, both in what they do as well as the mentality that they need to do things. Two, we have a new definition of liberty. And a new definition of liberty includes the idea that government will do more for us. Three, we have gendered expectations. Women are gaining economic equality in the workforce, and thus they start demanding social equality. Same thing with racial expectations. African Americans and other minorities are gaining economic equality during World War II, so afterwards they're going to demand social equality. And finally, foreign affairs. Because of World War II, we just wake up and decide we have to not just be active in foreign affairs, we have to lead the civilized world. We have to lead the free world against the evils that are before us during the Cold War, which we turn to next.